You can produce a building on your own, but then if you're doing it under someone else's banner, it's their work. And so there's that funny thing, like it's your art and it's the client's art, but that's not mine. It's the person whose name is on the door. I don't know if that's wrong or right, but that was a conflict for me for sure. I wasn't comfortable with the credit being completely given over to someone else. And maybe that's just my ego as an architect or an artist. But I realized that there had to be another way and something else that I wanted to try.
Hello and welcome to Architecture, Design, and Photography. Today we sat down with Eric Reinholdt. He is an architect in Mount Desert Island, Maine, and he has a very interesting approach to life and work and how he integrates the two. We sat down with him in his studio and had a really interesting conversation. Again, thank you to our sponsor, Maine Home Design, for sponsoring this podcast. You'll be able to see Eric Reinholdt's design theory article in the upcoming issue of Maine Home Design. Eric Reinholdt.
Hey, man.
How you doing?
Good. How are you?
I am well. So I'm up here because we're going to be working together tomorrow, and I figured it would be a really good time for us to have a conversation about the things that really interest us both. We're kind of like a 40-60, 40-60 match of each other. We both have an architecture background, but you've gone on to actually practice architecture, do it well, and do it on your own terms. Where I started to practice architecture and was like, can't do that. I'm going to do photography.
Right.
But I'm still very much involved in photography and architecture. And you've kind of evolved this practice of architecture and also added this YouTube element to it where you're interacting with an online community. And I mean, you've got photo gear and video gear all around here too. And we've collaborated on a short film that was really cool. And so we've done a lot together and we have a lot of shared interests. So we're talking. So
No, it's great to do that. Yeah, it's always fun to chat with somebody who's got way more experience in the photography realm than I do, but also that architecture background, which I think is actually uncommon. So
yeah, I wonder though. I bet if you took a survey of architectural photographers, a lot of them would end up having an architectural background.
You think? Right.
Well, when I started to shoot architecture on the very first project I got access to, I quit halfway through. Now, no one was paying me. Not state courthouse, but the regional something. The courthouse in Biddeford that I forget who did it, but they I kind of knew the guy, and he was like, "Oh yeah, I'll get you access like after hours or something." And I remember going to shoot it, and it was so incredibly difficult because I was trying to shoot something like from the inside rather than typically with photography you're looking at a subject from the outside.
Yeah.
Whereas interiors, you're exploring both the exterior and interior of a subject, and you have these high contrasts of light, and it's like you're on the inside of a human trying to photograph something that you don't really generally frame in your mind. You're always looking at things from the outside.
Sure,
so
yeah,
it's
objects versus space, yeah.
Yeah, it was an interesting thing, but yeah, it's a very, very difficult niche of photography for sure, but I've definitely been able to do a lot since then and force myself into learning how to do it. And, now actually I'm able to enjoy it and not quit halfay through. So
that's important.
Nice.
Yeah. It's tomorrow. Let's see if we can continue that tomorrow.
Right. Yeah. I'm not, where'd Trent go?
Uh-oh.
Crap. So I wanted to talk to you because I find it incredibly interesting how, your approach to your design practice is very much on your own terms. I think you probably experienced a lot of the same stresses and shortcomings in just the general practice as architecture works, and thought maybe that it could be a lot more creative and done differently to match a life that invigorates you. And I found that to be true even through the short film that we did.
For sure.
I was like, wow, this guy met with the same problem as me, but stuck the path and figured it out. Where I was like, I'm going to do something else altogether. So I wanted to first of all ask you, like, what drives you in the design that you do, in the interesting ways you find of even just planning your day? What is the core thing you think that really drives you in all of this?
I mean, I think, fundamentally it comes down to making things. And I think, there's plenty of people who sort of follow that path that I went through, and that sounds like you went through, where you end up in this office and you're sitting there in a cubicle, and it doesn't match your childhood vision of what you thought this was going to be. Like, you thought you were going to be sitting there doing drawings and building models, and like that's
going to be invigorating the whole time.
I mean, that's the whole thing that drew me to this profession, right? It's like I had this image in my mind, and it was doing all these things, drawing and making models and working with my hands, and then seeing things actually realized out of that process. And what I discovered was, I was drawing toilet plans, and I was doing the most mundane aspects of, design that there absolutely was. And that I didn't see a light at the end of the tunnel there. It looked like more and more and more of the same. Now, I started in a corporate environment. I don't know where you started working, but
I went right into owning half of a firm and doing garage master bedroom additions. That's like all we did at first.
Okay. Yeah.
And, I started my firm with a friend, and we basically, within 3 years, probably wanted to kill each other. So right. Now I have a friend and no more business partner, which is great.
Yes.
But yeah, it was difficult. You've gone the sole proprietor route, which is well advised from my experience.
Well, yeah. And that has limitations too. I mean, and we can get into that because, it's nice having some friction in a relationship like that, because I do feel like it produces better work. And it's something, as my business is like 5 years old, I've been on my own for 5 years now, and I'm starting to realize, okay, is that something I need? But, and, we can save that maybe for later in the conversation, but
I'm not going back into architecture. Don't ask.
Okay.
I make a terrible
I may be going into
employee,
photography.
by the way.
Yeah.
There you go.
But I think, being sort of disillusioned with that, or being disconnected from the making part was really the thing that drove me away from standard practice. And,
right.
there are other ways to practice architecture than just working in a corporate firm. And I moved to a residential firm, and I was pretty happy there. But what I realized was, the further you get, and this is true for a lot of professions, the more managerial your role becomes, the less of a connection you have to actually doing the thing. And,
right.
For a position like you, where you're out there and you're capturing photographs all the time and you're editing, right. I mean, I don't know the extent to which it's
an interesting dynamic with photography, that if someone calls me to get something done, they expect me to be on every aspect of the capture at minimum. So I have a studio manager and retoucher that retouches everything. It's a different thing, but I'm kind of directing that and overseeing it. I have, he's a technical wizard and an artist in what he does.
Sure.
But if someone were to show up and I weren't there in creating that, there would be a strong like, whoa, whoa, whoa. But with architecture, you can have the head of the firm show up and sell the whole project, but then other people design it, and that's an interesting difference in that whole practice. That
it felt funny to like, I got to a point where, if you're practicing for 18, 20 years, you're facile enough, you can produce a building on your own. But then if you're doing it under someone else's banner, it's like, it's their work. And so there's that funny thing, like it's your art and it's the client's art, and that's a collaboration. And I experienced this many times where I work with a client, we get to the end of it and it's like, but that's not mine. It's like, it's the person whose name is on the door. And that, like, I don't know if that's wrong or right, but that was a conflict for me for sure. Like I wasn't totally comfortable with that. I wasn't comfortable with the credit being completely given over to someone else. And maybe that's just my ego as an architect or an artist. But I realized that at some point that there had to be another way and something else that I wanted to try. And,
right.
You and I, when we made that short film, that really helped kind of suss out this idea. Like, my business has just been like a whole series of experiments. And I think, making is the act of taking an idea and turning it into a physical reality. And that can happen with architecture. That can happen with a business. Like, I found a lot of creativity in just like starting a business.
Like business, the creative approach to business to me is also very valuable. Yeah. And I find that I've often got ideas for other businesses going on in the back of my head that I have to keep killing. Right. I'm like, don't get distracted, Trent. This
Shiny
is what
object.
you do. Yeah. Squirrel. Yeah. Make sure you get the mic like no less than like 2 inches from your mouth, else we get fuzzy or not fuzzy, whatever. But
okay.
But yeah, so that creative approach, that idea of making, that like when you're in that process of making, what tells you yes and no as you're filtering through solutions and ideas and like to get at that core thing that drives you?
Yeah, it's it's funny because there's really only one way of knowing and doing that, and that is to like just sit in the chair and do it. And that's
subjectively be in that moment.
You have to, yeah. And also to have, to get there, you have to have tested like 100 ideas, or I don't know, 1,000 ideas.
Failed at a lot of things.
That's right.
For like my experience, I find that the more I fail, the better I get.
For sure. Yeah. And it's this, there's lots of studies that have been done, and I've studied creativity and the process of creativity. And there are distinct sort of modes of developing an idea. So there's this incubation process. So there's like time in the chair where you're sitting, fleshing out ideas and just throwing things on paper. And then there's also this incubation period where those ideas have to sort of lay fallow and sort of bake inside.
Right.
And at some moment, and various artists, and there's architects like Maya Lin, she refers to this process as like laying an egg. So at some point she's going to lay this egg. She doesn't know when that's going to happen, but it's kind of a neat idea because, you sort of have all these inputs and you're thinking on it and you're working on it very hard. But then there's a moment when you have to step away and let the sort of higher internal processes go to work. And for me, like I've built a schedule around this because this is the thing that sort of elicits the magic. Like,
right.
I can't totally explain it, but I just know that it works. And so, you and I have talked about this schedule before and how rigid and programmed it is, but I basically put the making in the morning because that's where my sort of highest horsepower,
fresh mind is like they're ready to go.
That's right. Yeah. And then in the afternoon I have my meetings and email and all this, I separate the managing from the making with this time of exercise.
And I've learned to never even try and call you in the morning because right. I know it's like you're in your holy space. And it's like, it's going to go to voicemail.
Right.
Like it did on the actual short film we made. It's actually me calling. And you're like,
right. Love that. I mean, I could see it was you, but yes, I didn't answer. But it's that process putting in, and you asked like, how do you know, like when you get the idea? And I think it's a process of doing. Like you can't just say like, I can't just tell you that it's going to come at this point or that point, or, after I've done 3 or 4 different schemes. Like it's just, you have to do the process and you discover it. It's like, it's kind of this excavation. It's unearthing these ideas. And when you find the right one, it sort of appears. It's not like the golden halo moment, but it's like, yeah, that feels,
it kind of like, it just emerges and you're like, oh, wow.
It feels right.
It is.
But and it also feels like it came from somewhere else. Like it wasn't something that was pre-programmed. And I think, as you get experience as a photographer, as an architect, whatever, you get known for doing like a certain thing, right? And it's like one of the hardest things to break out from, like, okay, well, I'm not, like, I want to do something different. And part of this like creative process is discovering, taking some risks and leaps of faith and saying, well, I'm going to depart here from my normal process.
Do you find that processes and even knowing the answer to a typical good solution to a common problem, will work, but you get bored with it? Or like I made a horrible, horrible employee. I could have never worked for someone else. And I would be completely bored if I knew I had a consistent income. Like for me, for some reason, being on the edge of failure, I intrinsically know that drives me.
It's really interesting. Yeah. I mean, I love that you said that because I think that's part, like I got to this point in this last firm that I was working for where it was like, God, it's like another house. It's another kitchen. It's like, and they're different clients and it's a different budget and maybe stylistic goals are different site. And so some things are different, but yeah, at some point, like something inside of me was like,
it's going to be the same solution here. It's going to be the same approach, same solution. And oh no, I'm bored.
Yeah. And I felt like I needed to step away from that. And also like that, the challenge of starting your own thing and really figuring out how to make it. Like there's nothing that makes you grind harder than that. And I really I really miss kind of those early days because I was free to experiment and fail. No one was watching. It's like now I have a YouTube channel that has 200,000 subscribers. And when you publish a video, like people are like, hey, that's terrible. Or, and there's a lot of people watching.
So honest.
So you're free to, do all these experiments and fail 1,000 times. And it felt so, like, at some level, so liberating. Right. And also, as you say, like, really scary, because you're responsible for bringing in the same level of income that you had before. And so that just became, to me, like, it opened up this whole, realm of, like, well, I could do this over here and I could experiment with this over here, and everything became a creative challenge, as opposed to, well, I'm going to get in the car and drive 70 miles to and from work and, just check in, check out. It felt
that I think there's an interesting, is catharsis the right word? But I think there's an interesting thing going on there where you've got the ability with the YouTube channel that you're able to try different creative approaches and processes that can fail, and no one gets hurt.
Right.
No one's wasted money. It's your own time, but you're hashing out approaches and ideas, just the aesthetics of a composition that you're working on and filming, compared to how that relates to, how a house frames a view beyond,
Yeah.
And that's a thing where you can work and fail and learn at your own expense easily, and then learn from it and maybe take it to a more medium risk area and then apply it to what people are really paying you to do. And that's an interesting way of looking at how if you had like a three-legged stool that stands up appropriately, without wobbling, that's kind of something that you've come to know about yourself, that's good to have this creative outlet and apply it in this way that kind of feeds on itself.
And that feeds the other creative work too, because, like, as you said, like, there's like cinematography, like that's a whole other, like, that's another career. Right?
That's why I pushed into that after working in still photography for a long time and really, really understanding composition and how I see it communicate and the emotions that you evoke with different compositions.
Right.
When I started to think about, like, wow, I could blow this all out of the water and fail so fantastically. If I start to, like, add movement to this, that's exciting,
But to me, that's like the next leap for architectural photography.
Oh yeah.
Like, I mean,
video capture.
Yeah. Like, why aren't we doing more of that? Because
I'm push it with so many clients, but it is, like, still photo has it really gets a lot communicated. And it does it in, it's an extremely short story,
For sure.
And the more you expand that with videography, it's like you're creating, infinitely more time to a degree, and you have to apply. Right? Yeah. And so the expense, the input, the challenge, just straight up. So you either have to approach, I think, architectural videography with a very, very loose and, like, all right, we need to really maximize our budget here. So what can we do? Keep it extremely freeform, turn it black and white, they're in really expressive it in that creative, loose approach, or go all out, So it's interesting when you start to look at the constraint. Like, I never enjoyed projects in architecture school that they're like, no budget. Is what I was like. That's
you want
not
constraints,
real.
right?
I wanted constraints to know where the creativity actually had to happen. It's just not realistic. So, but yeah, I sorry, I interrupted you on a different thing. But
no, I love talking about this.
Kind of fun where it's going.
Yeah, because we were talking about how this over here feeds this over here, right? And you were saying, okay, the thing that makes you money, but the reality and the thing that I was always struggling with was like, okay, well, how do I control my time? Because there's like three things that are really driving me forward, just in terms of my goals. I want to be able, I want to have the freedom to choose what I want to do each day.
That's so important. When you have employees, you have to compensate them well, give them freedom of their own time, control of their own schedule. Those are and appreciation.
Sure.
And it's like that control of your own time is just, it's like the most important to me.
It is. And like, this with doing architectural photography, like client work, like that doesn't, like, it's not leveraging your time, right? It's a 1-for-1 trade. Like, your time equals money. And so I was always struggling with this idea of like wanting to divorce from that. And like the typical architecture practice is like, client finds you, you work with that client, You do the project and it's done. You find another one, right? So that's
Right.
a fixed thing. So I'm trying to figure out like a more entrepreneurial approach to practice. And that's where the YouTube channel came in and all these other sort of experiments where I could do something and then over time it would pay me long term. And so this is the first year where it's actually flipped from like my client work is actually only 25% of my income.
Oh,
and
wow.
the passive stuff, the stuff that just pays me just
Right.
because it's there, is 75%. And that's
great.
That's a big shift.
Yeah.
You know, the year before it was like 50-50, and I've always been trying to make it more, you know, like 80-20.
It's interesting. You've made yourself kind of like a practicing professor.
Right.
You know, except
true,
you've made your own university online, essentially, with your creative process and sharing how you've learned what you know and
For
do.
sure. Yeah.
And so that's part of it. And then you know, you're kind of teaching there and then working, you know, so it's not like you're just theoretically doing this. You have
Right.
clients that you're serving.
Yeah.
And it's a great feeder back and forth.
Yeah, and I feel like I'd never want to step completely away from architecture because I love working with people, and like if I can wait around for the right client and it's the right project, like
Right.
it's great. It's a lot of fun. It's tons of fun, and then that feeds the YouTube channel. Like that's content for the YouTube channel. So
Right.
it's like this figuring out what the symbiosis is between those two arms, and then also using those as sort of creative outlets. And like because I can't just do one thing. I mean, like you're doing film and photography, and you're surfing. Like I don't know what, or maybe you're not surfing anymore.
Well, yeah, there's going to be really good waves tomorrow, and I'm working with you, darn it, Eric. And then there was really good waves on Tuesday, and I was working again. It's like all
So
summer.
no
It's
time
been
for that.
all summer. It's been flat.
It's client work.
and it's been
That's your problem.
clients. I gotta eliminate clients. I gotta eliminate people like you that pay my mortgage or whatever. Yeah, no, it's life, but.
But it sounds like you're using this for fodder for, you know, another creative like this is a creative experiment.
Yeah,
of
I mean,
yours,
from
right?
from interacting with you, I saw like the creative output you had with the YouTube channel, and you kept telling me like there's ability and opportunity here, and you know you should really move into that. And I have found by putting my ideas out there has made me have to refine them, share them, and be told I'm wrong. You know, which is it's a great learning experience.
It's
and
hard.
I find that if you can just simply acknowledge and move on, it's actually a very empowering thing. But that exploration into just truth as a thing on its own that I'm doing more so in the video and kind of creative content there, you know, applies back to what I'm doing with photography, and also that deeper search for truth, kind of being divorced from where I viewed it religiously before, has made me very much more so appreciate art and the approach to design and everything else. Like what drives me, you know, if maybe these things aren't true, maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But if I move into a place of these things that I previously thought were certain, if I move into a place of them being less certain, what kind of emphasis does that put on the other areas of my life where I pulled certainty from before to eliminate the uncertainty on these things?
Yeah.
And now I find that I have a much greater appreciation and a better understanding of art where I had basically none before. I find that art is just an incredible, you know, even in the most like scribbles of color on canvas, there seems to be an exploration and a search for truth even in that is very interesting to me, where I found in my previous kind of culture, if you'd call it that, much less of an appreciation for art because they already knew the answers.
There was a preconception there.
Yeah. And that's really interesting to me, and it opens up more exploration into these ideas of what does drive people, what, you know, which kind of leads me to my second question here with you. When you take architecture in, what do you see as like, wow, that's good architecture? Like what makes you see something as good when it comes to architecture?
Yeah. It's a really difficult question because I think there's, you know, there are academic answers to this. you and I both went to architecture school, so we know
Yeah,
form, space,
I actually
order.
wrote down a note in architecture school. There's no right or wrong, just a lot of strong opinions.
Yeah,
And I'm
that's
now
great.
now I'm finding that really pretty much applies to almost everything.
Sure.
There's very
Yeah.
little that is objectively certain, and something that's objective has extremely little meaning. It only means exactly what it means.
Yeah.
And then other things are inferred from it. But anyways, what makes good architecture, Eric?
Well, this is a completely loaded question. I was trying to avoid answering it, but I mean, it's funny because our first exposure to architecture is our home, right? And
Right.
that may or may not be good architecture, but I can almost guarantee you have associations with that home that are linked to architecture. Like maybe the way a door sounded slamming, maybe the way your curtains were in your room, or the light, the quality of light.
Right.
So it's this uniquely, like, it's an individual experience. And I think the way I view good architecture is its emotional tug on you.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there are plenty of buildings that may not meet the technical definition of great architecture that I absolutely love. Like barns, like an old barn. Maybe proportionally it's not perfect. Maybe the way it deals with light or doesn't address the northern exposure or southern exposure properly is terrible. But when I walk in there, I have a certain sense for the materiality and who created it and how it was put together.
Right.
And so it's those things that that really resonate with me pretty deeply. I don't know if you know Peter Zumthor, but he's a Swiss architect, Pritzker Prize winning architect, really great architectural thinker, who's written a lot about these sort of emotive qualities of architecture. And there are some really just basic things that I think make great space. And light is of course one of them, how light is handled. And materials is another. And I think just having a really simple palette of materials is, I don't know if you know Massimo Vignelli, but
I know that name. Yeah.
Yeah, so the great graphic designer, right? He essentially uses 4 typefaces in all of his work, right? He's no longer alive, but 4 typefaces. And
what did they put on his tombstone?
That's a really great question. I don't know, but it's interesting to really sort of take the elements of architecture. We have walls, we have openings in those walls, we have planes and points and paths through those places, and then they're rendered in material. So I think you can distill architecture down to just a really set of elemental things. And so the things that make great architecture for me are just very simple, humble structures, places where when I walk in, I sense there's a careful treatment of light, and that there was care taken to site it properly. I mean, a lot of my work is site derivative, and even this small little studio here, there's a lot of care put into how it's located and where the views are and how light is treated. And this idea about reacting to seasons here in Maine, we have 4 very distinct seasons, and so it's important that the building sort of makes you understand a place on a deeper level. And I don't have a 1-sentence answer for it, but I guess
Yeah, no. The first thing you were saying, the idea of like what your childhood informs your appreciation of architecture. My family was a very, very meager means growing up. So the architecture, pretty much was all bad, but there was parts of it that, I remember, like all the doors in our house where we lived in Ohio when I was a kid for a little bit, all the doors were slats. And so there was light that would come through and air. And I remember at night there was a pond in our front yard. The moonlight would come off of it and then come into my window, and I had my head against the window and I'd look at the wall and it would all, the light would play on it, which was really interesting.
I mean, I lived in this old schoolhouse, and
cool.
it was divided up into apartments at some point, and it had this like really strange warren of hallways and steps, and so it was like 38 stairs to get to my room, and my room was the absolute end of this hallway, and
38, not 38 up, but
sideways. You know,
Okay.
we go up here
And
to
you
a landing,
counted
and
them.
yeah, of course. And you know, it's this old, like really strange, but
Yeah.
like I'll never forget it, and I'll never forget the sound of walking on those floors and the pine wainscoting. Like there's all these things. Like yes, as a collection of buildings or as a home, maybe not the best example of architecture, but that sensual quality, like I'll never not associate that with home in some way. And
Right.
so that affects my work going forward. And it probably affects how, like your vision of what home might be. And
Right.
your kids will have a different vision of that.
You know what's interesting? I grew up also in Virginia for a while, and you know, my parents were attracted to the subdevelopment always, with all the houses cookie cutter the same, yards perfect. You know, oh my word, they left a trash can out front. It's horrible. But I find myself in moments where I'm at unease and looking for comfort. If I could be in a place where it was wall to wall, like cream carpet that was clean, and there was like
Stop.
very like clamshell molding, and the Weather Channel playing with this kind of, you know, the jazz music that they play in the background there sometimes.
Yeah, for sure.
It's a very like Williamsburg, Virginia kind of thing. Like being in that kind of environment, just because it's my childhood, gives me this like odd, like I cringe at the thought of how bad all the interior design and light and space, and it's horrible, but it appeals to me from a time when everything was taken care of by someone else, and I was
Simpler
just,
life. Yeah.
you know, being loved, and you know, it wasn't like life wasn't like grabbing at me from every angle or something. So.
I mean, I think about that, like when my family used to vacation in Belfast, and they rented this little cottage, which has long since burned down, but you know, there's this screen porch outside and the slam of that screen door,
Right.
and like that, like I hear that and I smell salt air and I hear the buoy in the harbor, and it's like, those associations are super powerful, and they're always tied to they're tied to architecture. I mean, most of our lives are spent in buildings,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so, yeah, it's an interesting dialogue. I think it's in order to know what great architecture is eventually. I mean, as a student of architecture, you know this. But you have to do a lot of sampling. It's like, you know, you have to, you know, change your palette. You have to experience a lot of different things. You have to travel a lot. You have to sample all of these things. And, you know, that experience then helps you to determine, you know, what is good architecture. And I think very few people actually do that or experience, you know, their travel life is around sort of certain theme parks or, you know, destinations that are must see destinations. But as architects or as a photographer, you're traveling with a different eye. And so you're able to seek out different places and really experience them. And, you know, I just came back from Utah, and, you know, one of the buildings I wanted to see was this visitor center at Zion National Park, like highly decorated building, like, you know, awarded because of its design process. And it was 30% cheaper to build than all the other sort of national park structures. And I got out there like with this lofty expectation, and I see the building and it completely fell flat for me. Like, that's great that you saved 30%, but it's like a terrible building, like in almost every respect. And so it's interesting that, you know, these buildings can be lifted up and awarded. The Frank Gehry's of the world can be, you know, praised for their artfulness and their design. But in reality, it's like how it makes you feel. And I walked into this building and I thought, like, well, this is like just a big cavern. There's like a ton of wasted space. Like there's no constant, there's nothing telling me where I need to go. And like visiting a national park is about wayfinding, right? You've never been there before. So help me wayfind. None of that. It's all absent. But yet the building is elevated by the architectural community to be this like, you know, shining star.
So did you do a YouTube video on that yet?
I haven't yet. No, it's coming.
Oh boy. Oh boy. So, interestingly to me, and probably why you're working with me and probably why we're having this conversation, we have I think a very similar taste in architectural design. What informed that taste? I mean, you probably didn't grow up in a house that looks like your house or this studio. I know I didn't grow up in a house that reflects the house that we were actually able to just finish building finally. Thank you, God.
Great.
But like, what informed your taste? Like for me, at the beginning of architecture, I had this one professor who was insanely just active mind and really excited about what he was doing.
Sure.
And he was from somewhere in Europe, and he had a very kind of more minimal and modernist approach. And I was just like, wow, this is really cool stuff.
Yeah.
And I've since found that I just very much gravitate towards minimalism and a modern take with a take on vernacular architecture as well, and like Scandinavian minimalism and that idea of simplicity.
Sure.
Really appeals to me. But that's kind of where I can source how that came to me, and it just naturally appeals to me. Where do you think you were informed for your taste on design?
Yeah, I think it's obviously a function of sort of where you come from, what you've sampled, your education, all of your life's experiences, right? It all passes through this filter. And I think, if I look way back, my father was a history professor, a lot of history in my house. He worked at a museum, so I was always accompanying him to museum.
Oh,
He was
cool.
a photographer. So like I'm always in the workshop with him, seeing old stuff. And we grew up in upstate New York, so lots of barns, lots of agriculture. It's a very rural place, not dissimilar to this place, but a huge farming tradition there. So, a love for barns and these big blank walls and these big, vacuous spaces, timber frames, all of those sort of historical elements. But when it comes to school, I realized, gosh, there's so much more to architecture than just this sort of historical notion of like what the past, the 1800s has given us, right? New England is sort of settled by, they imported the English tradition of barn making, and these sort of colonial homes were all built on that English tradition. Get to school and realize, okay, modern art, like there's this complete other world out here, right? And I traveled to New York, but it was nothing that was ever sort of viscerally like important to me. Those buildings seemed very disconnected from my personal experience. But get to school and I realized, yeah, there's minimalism. There's people like Tom Kundig. There's like, mechanistic sort of creation. Like architecture can look like 1,000 different things. And I think part of the process of going through design school is really sampling all those things and then putting it through your own hand and figuring out what you're actually capable of creating. Like there are things that I looked at in school that I thought, my God, this would be so fantastic if I could do that. And I would try to do that and it would fall flat. I mean, I'm sure you had this experience. Like everyone wants to do the current trend in architecture. So in school, when I was in school, it was deconstruction and everyone wants to be a decon architect. So it's like these crazy, I mean, you remember that style, I'm sure. It's very aggressive and bold design moves. But what you realize is that, part of creating your style is figuring out what your past is, understanding your past, and then figuring out how you're going to move that into the future. And what I realized was that my design process was more of a reductive design process. I was not good at adding things and making it look better. I was always better at taking things away. And so I think, finding a more simplistic style just felt right to me. The more I took away, the better it looked to me. And you always have this like,
I'm doing that with my photography all the time.
Is
It
that
just
right?
feels like
Yeah.
it's a calmer, more able to take the space in, the less that there's in
sure.
it. And it's
Yeah.
just kind of I don't know, for me, it just has this feeling of serenity and peace that I can relax in.
And it I don't know if you're video editing now too, but I found editing has its own like creative process to it. But as I'm editing videos, like putting blank space in there, like it's just as critical as architecture, like having blank wall. Like we have blank walls in here and people are like, well, why didn't you put a window there? It's like, well, there's lots of reasons, but like without a window, it means the bigger windows have more power when that wall is completely blank. And so, I mean, you learn these things over time by doing, but I think this approach of pulling things away is certainly a design of approach that I found worked for me. And I always felt happier doing it rather than the additive approach. It was subtractive. And, and now that I'm getting more into video editing, it's the same thing. Like putting black in the video, just like a black space, like just pausing, like so much power to that. Right.
Yeah. Like a black space with just some audio in it. You can for a second visually shut down and just take in the sentiment of what's being said. Or
but it's room to appreciate something. And that's, I mean, I guess that's how the style evolved, and obviously it's always evolving, right? The more
Right.
you experience, the more places you travel, the things that you take in, and the clients that you work with, they'll bring a certain style and aesthetic too that, you know, you're forced to interact with and engage with. So
It's unfortunate that more architectural publications can't do that. They have to fill everything with advertising.
yeah.
And
That's
so it's
interesting.
very rare you get like a really good, you know, a good architectural book, you know, that like the more modern ones will
Yes.
have like a big photo and then a lot of blank white space
sure.
and just a little bit of text somewhere. And to me, I've always looked through that and been like, oh, this is so great. And then you open up an architecture publication and it's just ads and ads and ads and busy. And it's like, ugh. But yeah, that's, I don't know, nature of capitalism and everything else, which I am a proponent of, but anyways.
No ads on this podcast.
Yeah, no, there's no ads yet, but I'm definitely in favor of
Sponsors.
sponsors. So we've already discussed how you've creatively approached making a living as an architect. We bored your
It's a sign.
backpack to death. What do you think the key is for you personally that has made you able to succeed at making a living as an architect, to creatively make a living? That's not an easy thing to do. Everyone in our world generally works for someone else, as in an employer, rather than single, clients. It's not an easy thing to make money as a creative and pay for a house and family and kid. You know, what is it about your personality, and what are some of the choices you've made, you think, that has made you successful?
Yeah, I think, I mean, if I were to say one thing, it would just be that I relentlessly execute on ideas. And I think a lot of people have a lot of ideas, but that's where it ends. The idea.
How do you pick the ones you're gonna go on? That's a hard thing for me. Like I have a hard time staying on like the one thing that's working for me. It's like, you know.
Well, it gets easier the farther you get into it. But in the beginning, like when I was first starting this, I did everything. And like people don't like hearing that because that's not easy. You know, I tried writing, I tried making videos, I tried taking photographs, I tried a whole bunch of different things. Like I tried working, you know, with clients one-on-one. I tried doing consulting. I tried like all these things, right? And what I did was I figured out which ones gave me the most creative energy and the most feedback, and the ones where I saw the most potential to leverage my time. Yep. So YouTube ended up being a great confluence of all of those things because it's a creative outlet. I get to film architecture. I get to think about editing. I get to learn about cinematography. So there's like this whole headspace in there that I just unlocked. I didn't even know it was there. It's also a way to earn income, and it's a way to promote my business so I can get new clients that way. It just ended up being this kind of perfect storm to invest in. And there are others like writing, which I love writing, and I've sort of stepped away from it for a while now because I realized I wasn't getting the same creative feedback from it that I was.
But I mean, don't you
videos.
apply that a lot into the YouTube videos you
I do?
Because you're scripting those to a large degree.
Yeah, some and less so now, just because now I feel like it's got to be a little more organic, and the feedback loop that I've gotten from that is like, hey, we want to just get to know you on a more informal basis, and so like that's why something like this is great, because I think YouTube, it's about you, right? And so if I'm scripting everything and it's just a lesson, a professorial lesson, who cares at some level? And when you and I work together, learning about story, like
that's
unlocking
such a
that,
huge part. That's the
huge.
most powerful technology that humans have ever made.
And that the things that people are going to take away from this are going to be based on story. Like the stuff you'll remember are, the pieces that were tied to a story, not the factual information, not how many fonts Vignelli used, right? It's all story based. And so to me, looking for that feedback loop, trying a bunch of things, executing on a bunch of things, and then seeing what pays back creatively, is really important. There's also the financial aspect, right? I mean, this has to work financially. And so I really struggled hard in the beginning to make it work financially. And I realized that, if I was going to take, 10 different clients, small little projects, and get on this hamster wheel of like doing a little renovation, like you were talking about, addition, renovation, like what's that, 3 or 4 months worth of work, if that, and then I have to find a new client, and it's like all these little things. No, I'm going to wait for big client to come along, good project, nice people to work with. But in order to wait that long, I need to have revenue that's supporting that. So
right.
I did plan sets. I wrote books. I'm doing advertising revenue. I'm doing affiliate, like all this stuff, because I want that to leverage my time so that I can wait for these bigger commissions to come in. And so that's kind of how I made it work. Like that's a more entrepreneurial approach to practice. Most people just say, I'm going to do the client thing. And whatever that looks like, it's going to be a struggle. Like it is a struggle. And I talk to people every week that are in that same position. Like, well, how do you do this? And like, we have to like,
keep your expenses low, work hard.
Well, that's true. And it's like, it is executing. And I think most people, the execution part, that's where it falls flat. And you just have to relentlessly execute. And like, I made videos for, I've been making videos since 2013. And like in 2017, like after you and I made the film, that's when the channel changed, because I had this new...
I'm going to take full credit
you
for
should.
that.
You should at least take partial credit, because the idea about story and this idea about cinematic like storytelling is like, it changed the way I view it. And it changed my interest and energy level with it too, because like that's a real creative nut to crack.
How are you with story? Like it's the hardest thing I've ever tried to approach, because it does not make sense to me. I know how to consume it and be moved by it, obviously, but I don't know how to tell it. I can't verbally do it. I know how to aesthetically approach telling a story, but to timeline it and to build the suspense, and then to like, it's a different form of creativity that I have to really, really work on.
Yeah. What I found that works for me is, saying things off the cuff, like coming up with lines like, here's how I'm feeling, and I'm going to say it 16 different ways. And then what I do, and this is a personal editing choice, and yours may be different than mine, but my creative process is kind of revealed this is the way that I'm moving forward, in that like there's a statement, and then I put that statement in the editor, and I look at that with some visuals laid over it, and then things start to fall into place. Like I say, okay, like this is the emotion, and these are the visuals that support that. Now, how do I draw that out? Like, how do I turn that into a full story? And it ends up being like,
interesting.
It's less sort of like talking head and like voiceover stuff than it is just like emotions that are sort of pieced together visually. Right. And, I don't know if that'll work for you or not, but that's kind of what I'm experimenting.
Yeah, that's interesting.
It's also like a matter of like watching films. Like it's such a great, like you're doing research and you're getting to watch a film, and it's
right.
And it's like, you're putting that through your own architectural photographer's lens or your truth lens. Like, and so all these ideas come welling up. Like it's just that's the great part about this creative process.
When do you get your best ideas, do you think?
Always when I'm exercising. So when I'm hiking. Too. Yeah.
Like I can be stewing on something, but I've lost the ability to go running currently because of my foot is acting weird, but man. I'll paddle on my surfboard in the river.
Yeah.
And I go, I think it's about a, half mile-ish or mile loop or something. But back and forth. But I go from like this spot up to 95 where there's all these cars buzzing over on the bridge, and I'm in this like no one's around crazy. Quietness that's up there, and it's pretty cool. But constantly, like if I'm exercising or riding my bike doing that, it's like the ideas coalesce. And that's the exact verbiage that you used in the movie too.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just so weird how that physical activity, like all the things you've been kind of log jam with before, all of a sudden it just kind of like
unlocks.
Oh.
So do you ever film that? Have you ever GoPro'd it or something?
No, I haven't.
Or is that sacred space? Do you?
I don't know. I don't know. Like all of my production ideas and everything have been mostly focused on other people's stories, except for the one big thing that's kind of, I don't know if I'm procrastinating
You
on,
are.
or
Like,
if
when's it
it's
gonna be
not.
done?
I mean, it's been in the works now for coming up on 3 years, and I
Execute.
so want to get it done. But the problem is the story isn't done. Like I haven't come to a place of understanding how to emotionally be okay with uncertainty, because I was steeped. I mean, it's obvious, like
That's the
now,
story, right?
yeah, but like I don't want to put together a whole film that says, well, I just came to a difficult place and I don't know what to do now. Like I don't know. It still seems like the story in general right now is still very log jammed. So I
I
don't
love
know.
this as a creative experiment because, I mean, you could finish that film today if you wanted to.
I could. I've got
Or it's-
so many vignettes, like story vignettes that
I'm
tell
sure.
parts of it. I halfway want to put together a whole film that's just vignettes that you only at the end are like, oh, okay. Like I've got all these just scenes that are just so disrespectful, truthful, humorous, and just odd and wrong but right. And it's weird. Like in the disgracing something, there's a truth in there that you find, because like, well, why is that disgraceful? You know, or why do you call this wrong and this right? You know, it's really interesting how much comes through and all that. But yeah,
Do you know, I'm going to interrupt you here, because do you know that film, The Five Constraints? It's, I'm pretty sure it's Lars von Trier that they put through this sort of 5 versions of the same film, and they give him different constraints. So it's a script.
interesting.
He's got to make this short film, and they give him different constraints throughout each one. Like you can't use
And
actors.
did he make 5 versions of this?
5 short?
Oh,
and
cool.
you get to see it. So there's your thing, right? I mean, you could do 5. Like that's the funny part about this is like you're making a creative choice not to finish it, and it's because it's something that's weighing on you, and you feel like maybe there isn't an end, but like there could easily be an end point to one creative project. I mean, it's like a serial series, right? There could be 5 different
I've thought
endings to
about it too, of doing it in series too, but it's such a thing that I still have so little emotional peace with still, that I'm almost scared to go there. Maybe I don't know.
I don't know. That's the best stuff.
I've got a room about this from here to the wall, that size, and there's sticky notes like all over of all these different analogies for, reasons that people desire certainty, even in areas where they know they can't prove it, but they still claim it. And just, a lot of things that are contradictions,
I mean, that's a film within a film right there.
Well, like just one of the sticky notes you could expound upon for, a 30-minute film that would be really interesting. So
even watching you waffle on the uncertainty of it all
very entertaining
is
for you.
entertaining to turn the camera on yourself. And
I'm working on it. All right. So last question, so we don't go too long on these.
Sorry.
Talk to me about photography from an architect's perspective, because we are going to have, or we already do have people listening, behind the curtain. This is the first podcast we've done for this one, but it might not be the first one that airs. I don't know. But anyways, I want to approach architecture, design, and photography, just discussing those 3 things, and that's just the key here.
Sure.
And the very underlying thing is that we're talking about truth, essentially, underneath all that.
Mm-hmm.
But as an architect approaching photography, what is it that you look for in photography and communicating your in communicating your built spaces that you've designed, that you've executed, and what is it that you're looking for, you think? What is it that you gravitate to?
Well, I mean, obviously, I actually don't know if this is the right place to start, because I think when I say obviously, like stylistically, I gravitate toward your images, and I think there's, the thing about those images is that they are stripped down. So I think our aesthetic match there is good, but also I'm not a student of architectural photography, so I don't actually know if that's bad, because when people come to me with a stylistic sort of idea of what they want in their home, I sort of bristle at that notion. So, but for you also, it's like, this is a body of work that is an expression of your vision of a place too, right? So your compositions, like,
well, it's an interesting duet between architect and photographer to execute a communication of something that you've put like immense amount of effort,
Sure.
blood, sweat, and tears into to actually get built. Because, I mean, why couldn't you just put renderings all over your website? Well,
Right.
no one would believe you that you could actually do what you do. But when you show that you've done that, you end up with the tip of your spear to execute the next thing. And that's where you work with a photographer for that.
sure. Yeah.
And that's the real deal, or, a videographer to also communicate it that way. And it's such a delicate thing, I think, where you don't, as a photographer, you don't really want to bring in a lot of your own voice that's going to sing as a solo over and above the architecture. Do you see what I'm saying?
I do, but it's interesting. I think, architects are, I think, maybe a different client in a lot of ways because, for me, I have respect for the artist and not wanting to step on the sort of artistic vision that you bring to it because, I've seen this place evolve over a period of 2 years, the place we're going to photograph, right? It's been in my mind's eye. It's the first time I went out there and now I see my client living in it and I get to see it in all these different ways. And you're going to see it for 6 or 8 hours. And you're going to have to walk in there and have
distill it down to the great moments.
That's right.
Yeah.
And that's a big challenge, but it's also something that I think is really interesting because someone coming in and viewing something and experiencing a place for the first time is going to have a certain set of emotions. And I think those will come through in the photographs. Like I may have certain angles or views that I think are great, but I'm not interested in that as much as I am interested in like what you bring to the table.
Right.
And I wouldn't say that's true for every photographer that I've worked with. But because I know your work and we've worked together before, like I trust that, that vision, making the end result better than what I could have pre-programmed. And I think, those are the kind of clients that I look for in architecture too. Like I don't want someone coming to me saying, well, I really just need an 1880s, Victorian shingle style home and it just needs to be right here. And this is actually where we want it. And we have the plan all done, right? Like that's not interesting to you. Right. And I actually don't know if it's an interesting creative challenge for you anyway. I just end up
charging a lot more money for those kind of things. Like, oh, this isn't going to be interesting. Let me make sure I factor for that on the estimate. Yeah.
Well, that's why your film's not done.
Yeah, maybe.
You have to say no to those people.
Yeah. It's just so hard though when you're at this stage of life and you don't have a trust fund.
I don't have one either, man.
Yeah.
It's a hump. It is for sure. And what I did a video on this one time because I had a bunch of questions, people saying, well, how do you manage to get this done? And I just said that I sleep less because I get up really early and people were not.
When do you typically get up?
I get up at 4.
Really? I did that a little bit last week, finishing a campaign video that we're doing for Marty Groman.
Oh, right on.
That was pretty fun. Yeah, he's an independent running for not Senate, Congress District number 1 in Maine. So you can't vote for him. Also, I'd give you the whole pitch, but really great guy. But yeah, I kind of wrote and pitched the whole thing and based it around the YouTube series that I'm doing for this other entity that I'm working on, just searching for truth.
Cool. Yeah.
But it's a very YouTube informational fast edit with just white background and drawings coming in and out. And yeah, the deadline was just, and so I was like, all right, I'm getting up at 4. So like a couple days in the morning, but man, I get so much done between like 4 and 8. It's like, geez, I've worked a half day and now I'm just going to hang out with the kids for a bit.
But my thing is like that, I feel like that puts me ahead of everybody else. And it's like a kind of evil little sort of voice in here that's like, yeah, you just lapped like, 1,200 people. And so when people ask me that, it's like, get up earlier. And it's not a popular idea, but it actually does work.
Oh no, it totally does work. You can get so much more done in those 4 hours before 8 than you can the rest of the day because the phone's not ringing, the kids aren't coming in, nothing. You can just plow forward. So.
And you pay for it on the other end of the day.
Well, the thing I like is that if I don't do that, I'm such a night owl that I won't go to sleep till like 11 or 12. But if I'm getting up at 4, man, like 8:30, 9, I'm dozing off. I'm like, dude, it just feels nice. I can go to sleep.
But the night owl thing doesn't work for you? Because my wife, she can work like at night. That's her jam.
Well, see, here's the thing. Like my wife doesn't put our kids to bed until about 8:30. And I find that if I'll just get up at 4 anyways. And then if I'm burning I just
kill her. Yeah.
If I try and work from like 8:30 to 12 and then sleep in, I just can't sleep in either. Like I'd naturally get up like probably at 6.
Yeah.
Anyways,
Sure.
so I'm only, 2 hours. So
yeah.
Anyways.
So is it a creative challenge for you doing architectural photography? Not to turn the tables on you, but it's interesting to me because you're doing the same thing all the time, right? Like it's another home, it's another commercial project. Like what is it is interesting for you?
It can definitely get old. Anything, and this is what I've learned. I mean, I get up to go work on the days when I'm shooting, and I'm just going to make pretty pictures. And how many people would love to not be going to their cubicle so they could just go take pretty pictures? But holy cow, is it not mind numbing, but it just, by the end of the day, it's like someone's just been hitting your head with a sledgehammer.
Yeah.
There's something odd about the intense creative process that is the amount of money that someone pays you to show up on that day, and everyone's time, is architecture photography is like your God in that little, footprint for the day,
For sure.
But at the same time, if you don't produce, you might have to go get a job that you don't want. So the pressure is high and the creative intensity is really high. So that's very invigorating, but obviously if you do the same type of subject matter over and over and over, that could get boring. But the great thing is I'm not generally shooting the exact same thing over and over and over. So everything is really different from day to day. Now, if I just kept photographing, I always want to say photography, but if I just kept photographing, like residential high rises over and over and over, and there's a gym and there's a pool and then there's, that would get boring. But, I really appreciate the days where I get to come and shoot, architecture that's more so along my aesthetic that I'm interested, like tomorrow. Next week, we're doing a really great project for Witten that's down in Roque Bluffs, which is going to be great. Yeah. And then we have other clients that we're going, across the country to shoot stuff for that might not be as architecturally interesting, but they bring different challenges. And it's just a different business model around it and everything else.
Sure.
It's anything can turn into work. And, an interesting thing is that if I'm not working, I'm not holding a camera ever.
Really?
Ever. I do not pick up a camera. Huh. And there's part of that that's intentional, that I know that I want to save my creative energy in that aspect for work because I want to, make money and be valuable when people are paying me to do that. And if I'm shooting all this other stuff, I feel like if I'm shooting something, I'm making work for myself, for one. And if I don't have a preconceived idea for what I'm holding a camera for, it's uncomfortable for me. Yeah. I don't like it. I'm like, I'm just out here wasting my time. And that's not my creative process. I have a friend who's a commercial photographer who's always taking photos, and he'll like have these great images of, like a surfboard fin lit from behind, and it's a great color. And he has these great posts on Instagram, and he falls into more opportunities because of a lot of this stuff he does too. Yeah. And so I think there's just a different mentality there that I need to have kind of and this is probably why architecture photography has worked out well for me. I have a very preconceived idea, a creative idea that I'll generally work around. So if I have, a building I'm shooting, that's very preconceived already. And then we're kind of meeting that there and approaching that and finding the composition that day. Or if I'm doing a personal project, I will develop that idea ahead of time and have a concept for it, figure out how I'm going to execute it, and then execute it. It's kind of like an execution of a factory or something for me.
Yeah.
Like it's my own little one-man factory, rather than, I just happened across this moment. It's just not me.
Yeah.
That's not how I work.
Yeah,
so
no, I love that idea.
It's a really interesting process when you start to look into other people's creative process, and doing the short film with you, seeing how you structure your day to complement your creative process. Everyone that I've shown that to and have they've all kind of like, that's really interesting. Yeah, I should try that. And I still struggle with that because
it doesn't work for everybody. Yeah.
I'll get up in the morning sometimes and, I'll try and put some time aside to work on the documentary I'm working on. And it's like everything I can do to not open the email I need to take time in the morning to sit, like even in the dark, and just meditate for a bit to try and get my head clear. And it's just like, don't look at the email, because if I open that email, man, it's just like,
it's a hole.
It's weird. It's like it's a drug or something, and you're just like, I'm going to get stuff done, and I'm going to feel better.
And it's avoidance of the hard work is finishing the documentary, right? That's the reason you're avoiding it. And and I get it, man, because I face it every day.
It's funny. I'm working, I'm taking other classes from people who have done similar types of things, and I'm on my second class that's very expensive but very worthwhile in kind of forming ideas around that and how to approach it, how to make it, eventually be financially viable and everything else, which is great. But I'm definitely, it's 3 years out, and films take time that are, I think, of that subject matter as well. But there's definitely a point where I'm going to have to say, we got to finish here, buddy. Tell my inner child that's ran and hid under the bed, like, all right, you've got to approach this, or you've got to finish this. So, but anyways, this has been really interesting, because I know both of us tend a little more towards introversion, and like this has been a nonstop, just like, I have so many things I want to talk about, and like as soon as you get an introvert talking about the things that really get them going, you can't shut them up.
Well, I think being an introvert is also like, you don't derive your energy from being extroverted, but it doesn't mean you're never extroverted.
It's like you're putting all that energy into working out these ideas, it kind of seems like. And then like all of a sudden you're one-on-one talking about them, and it's just like,
exactly.
Like I go to a therapist to like marriage counseling and everything else. And it's funny because my wife and I will, every other situation we're in, she's super extroverted and just talks and storyteller. When we get into that kind of a thing where we're talking about our relationship in very deep ideas, and I'm just like, and at the end, she's looking at me like, I didn't even get to talk, And I was like, well, you talk all the rest of the time. I'll talk this time, Another thing I need to work on maybe. But
well, it's interesting, like, because the creative, so tomorrow with the photo shoot, right? So now I have this insight into like what a grind it's going to be for you. Like at the end of the day, like, and it's that like introvert in you, like having to be the extrovert and perform and do all
that's
those
not
things, right?
Extroversion for me though. That's
like performing like that. Like
no,
it's not.
It's
okay, that's interesting.
Like small talk that's performing for me.
I see. Yeah.
Like when I'm approaching shooting a home, that is just what I absolutely know I know how to do.
You're locked in. Okay.
And I think people feel that and get that, and that's, I'm at a point where I've done it enough to where I don't second guess that.
Yeah.
There used to be a lot of times at the end of a shoot where I'd be like, oh man, did I get it? Did I get it? And I get back and look at the image and like, yeah, we really got this. This is good. And anymore, there's a different confidence that I can walk away from so many compositions now.
Okay.
Which is interesting.
That is interesting. Yeah.
Whereas before it was like, better get everything. But I think also a lot of that might have been informed that I was working for publications that wouldn't send you with anyone. You just go there by yourself and they'd say, get everything you can. And that's just kind of like, oh,
wow.
Yeah, that's pretty scary.
Just spraying the
yeah,
spraying the camera.
You don't end up getting as good of results. But
I'll bet. Yeah.
Well, it's been a really interesting
Hey, man.
conversation.
Yeah,
I feel
thank
like
you.
there's so much more we could talk about, but I don't want to make more work for myself at this point. So next time we shoot, we're going to do this again.
Perfect.
And we're going
I
to
can't
see
wait.
how
Yeah.
your life has changed and your approach and mine, and we'll see what happens.
And
from
the
there.
film better
So-
be done, man. So it's a
gosh.
deadline.
Right. Well,
I
I'll
appreciate
get-
it, man. It was great chatting with you.
Cool.